Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Sustaining the Herd, brought to you by Sechi Agri-Services and Engineering of Raymond, Nebraska. I'm your host, Brock Vitek, joined as always by my co-host, Andrew Wadle. For all of our faithful listeners, thank you for coming back for another episode. And for those of you who may be new to Sustaining the Herd, we are so glad that you're here today. We have a special guest joining us today as we dive into all aspects of innovation and sustainability in agriculture like usual, with a particular focus on animal agriculture. We're honored to have Mark Fahleson with us. Mark, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself and help us understand how you've gotten to where you are today.
Yep. Brock, Andrew, thanks for allowing me to participate. I'll be honest with you, this is my first interview on a podcast, but I'm looking forward to it. I grew up on a small farm north of Lincoln, Nebraska. And while I was growing up, my dad did not farm, but at the age of 11, 12, I purchased my first Angus heifer through a loan I took out from the Production Credit Association at a whopping interest rate of 16%. And so that's how I started my cattle herd. I ended up attending the University of Nebraska College of Agriculture, starting off in animal science, and ended up with a degree in agricultural honors. I got to the end of my undergrad, and it was a really difficult time for those who may remember in the ag economy. There weren't a lot of jobs to be had. Farm bankruptcies were at a historic high. And so people were telling me, ag is dead, you need to go find something else. And my roommate at the time happened to be taking the law school entrance exam. I didn't know a lawyer, had never met a lawyer. And I thought, what the heck, I'll go do it. And next thing you knew, I was attending the University of Nebraska College of Law. And except for a few points where I took other jobs for the last 25, nearly 30 years, I've been practicing law primarily in Lincoln, Nebraska.
That's outstanding. Thanks for that intro, Mark. And which firm are you with today, and what are your areas of practice there?
I'm with the Rembolt Ludtke law firm based in Lincoln. We have a Seward office as well. We have clients in all 93 of Nebraska's counties. And in recent years, we should have known this already, but the light bulb went off for us that we have a significant presence in agriculture in Nebraska. And so we've really tried to target the ag industry because when we looked at it, that's where our clients were. And everyone knows that agriculture is the number one industry in the state of Nebraska.
And Mark, when we first met you and we were talking about having this podcast, you dug a little bit deeper into your background as it relates to cattle. So it'd be really interesting for you just to let our audience know. So you bought that heifer, and then what did you grow your cattle herd to, and what became of it?
That's a great question. So I grew that to about 25 cows, 25 cow-calf pairs, and maybe it was a good investment. I certainly got a decent return on the investment, but I ended up selling those to pay to go to law school. And so I got completely out of the cattle business. And it was only in the last decade, because I had a daughter who was interested in agriculture. She and I started purchasing cattle again, and so I ended up buying a small farm outside of Lincoln, and I run a small little cow-calf herd down there as well. And that daughter, it all worked out. She ended up majoring in agriculture at the University of Wyoming, and now works for the Oklahoma State University College of Agriculture down there. So again, to the extent there's succession planning in farming, there's also succession planning in agriculture, and she's part of my succession plan.
That's excellent, and surely a service that attorneys offer. So, just give us a little more of a sense of the breadth and depth of your practice area.
Yeah, our firm is 35 lawyers, and so we do virtually everything except we don't do criminal law, so don't call me if you get in trouble. But my practice is primarily two areas, which is employment law, employment and labor issues, including those that arise on farms and ranches and agribusiness, and just general business advice. And so, but we have folks in our firm that do every other area of business law, and that including a significant presence in succession planning with farmers and ranchers. And so, again, if it involves agriculture, agribusiness, chances are we're operating and providing legal advice in that space.
Yeah, and so you certainly have a background in cattle and in ag, and can you just give us some examples as a practicing attorney where that knowledge of ag, that knowledge of cattle comes into to being really useful in working with clients?
Yeah, great question. So I heard someone phrase it this way the other day, and I think it makes sense. with my background in agriculture, with currently still having a small operation, I'm part of the club, if you will. And what that means is I understand the impact of $4 corn. I understand the impact of property taxes on ag operations. And so I at least have a firsthand understanding of how that impacts agriculture from a production standpoint and from an agribusiness standpoint. And I've used that knowledge over the years in a variety of ways. And without revealing too many client confidences or any client confidences, I'll give you a couple of examples. We were hired by a cattle producer in Nebraska who had sold a bull. And that bull had been properly semen tested, turned out fine. He sold the bull, and the person who purchased that bull said, all 20 of my cows came up open. There must be something wrong with the bull. Because I had enough experience in animal science, I understood there may be something else in play. We were able to retain an expert and discovered that the cattle were running on fescue grass down in Missouri. And there's a certain condition with fescue in some situations that may cause infertility in cattle. Sure enough, that's what the problem was. And so we were able to solve the problem. And I only knew that because I had experience in the cattle industry. Another example, which unfortunately is still ongoing, is a dispute over ownership of some cattle. And these cattle ended up being harvested. And so the question has become, what was the value of that cattle? It was about 40 head of cattle. And so before we harvested them, because of my knowledge and experience and relationships in Nebraska agriculture, we grabbed some DNA from those cattle before we harvested them and now have the DNA on them. We have the representations made by the person who claims these cattle belong to. And so we're sitting on a nice little set of data in which we can compare the genetics of those animals to determine what exactly was their value based upon their EPDs and other data. So it's just having that knowledge, I think, has been a benefit to our clients because I'm not walking in, wondering what a heifer is or wondering what a cow is. I at least have some understanding and some relationship to the industry as it operates today.
Yeah, that's really huge because we kind of speak the same language from the standpoint that we are a specialist agricultural engineering firm working primarily in animal agriculture. There's lots of really, really good civil engineers out there, but they are not accustomed to applying the profession of engineering to agriculture. And so we surely see the value of people being able to walk the walk and talk the talk all together.
Yeah, we have a number of clients that have used Setchi, and without a doubt, you guys are the platinum or gold standard in the industry. Again, everything Setchi does is top notch in quality, and again, we have no problem recommending you guys to our clients.
Oh, that's very, very kind.
We really appreciate that. Thanks, Mark. Pivoting a bit, we know that agricultural operations take all shapes and forms, whether that's a feedlot, a ranch, an ethanol plant, or what we're starting to see more of, anaerobic digestion and renewable natural gas production. We know agriculture spans the gamut of possibilities. So in your experience, Mark, where is an area most overlooked when it comes to hiring an attorney? Or in other words, where do you find yourself saying they really should have hired an attorney for this?
So I understand the fear or the consternation about hiring a lawyer, right? I frankly, I completely 100% understand it. And certainly I've heard my share of lawyer jokes from my ag friends over the years. That being said, buying that 1 hour of time to just sit down with an attorney before you start a project is of tremendous benefit because one of the things we're taught in law school is to issue spot. And so we're looking for potential issues from a regulatory standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from a contractual standpoint that, hey, have you thought of this? Have you thought of this regulation? Did you know we may have to get approval from this particular agency? And so allowing that attorney to help you issue spot in just what may be a 1 hour meeting, then you can decide from a standpoint from how much you want to spend, what hoops you have to jump through, whether that's work you can do yourselves or need to hire a lawyer for, you can at least be able to make those decisions, informed decisions for yourself rather than going into it blind. It is well worth the 1 hour of buying a 1 hour from an attorney to help have that attorney help you issue spot. It's going to pay dividends down the road. One other, you mentioned, issues that have come up. One thing I thought of, there is this myth out there, and I love my friends in ag, but sometimes there's this belief in some circles in agriculture is that there's somehow this blanket exemption for agriculture. I don't have to get that permit because I'm an ag producer. I have a ranch, and therefore that doesn't apply to me. Yes, there are some laws that have ag exemptions, but they're not as broad as people think. And so I'll give you one example. I have a client who is in agro-tourism, and they, in addition to having a farm where they produce the particular product, they have an actual retail store as well. And so they had employees that went back and forth between the farm in which they're actually tilling, harvesting the crop, as well as working in the store. And this particular business believed that many of the labor and employment laws didn't apply to them because they're in agriculture. Well, once that individual steps foot into that retail establishment, chances are that ag exemption is lost. And so, given the hybrid nature of many ag operations today, this sort of belief or myth, if you will, that there's a broad exemption from in many laws for all of agriculture, that's simply not true. And so, we need to make sure you have a good understanding of what the regulatory requirements are, especially when you're moving into areas outside of just traditional production agriculture.
That's great advice. I think my takeaway is, when in doubt, pay for an hour of an attorney's time, and that might be worth a lot more than you paid for it down the road.
Yeah, one thing I'd mentioned, again, hiring. Let's say you've never hired a lawyer before. It's negotiable, folks. Any lawyer is going to say, okay, what is it that you need? So do not be, if they, for example, if they say my rate is X, don't let that rate scare you, because someone who may be at a higher hourly rate can do it, a tenth of the amount of time, just based upon the experience that they have, than a newbie, a lawyer straight out of law school, who may have an hourly rate that's half that amount, but it may take him 10 hours to get the project done. And so don't be sort of fixated on the hourly rate. The other part is, and I wish clients would do this more often because it actually works best for the attorney as well as the client, negotiate a flat fee. No matter what the project is, if you want them to draft a contract, rather than having the uncertainty of, how many hours is he or she going to spend drafting this thing, say, I need this contract. What do you estimate your fees to be? And if the attorney says $800, say, how about 500? Come up with a number. That way both parties going in know what the expense is going to be. I think most folks would be surprised or shocked to know the attorney rates are negotiable, and the attorneys actually prefer billing on a project by project basis as opposed to an hourly basis, which frankly is just a historical accident. The attorneys bill by the hour. It's simply, people don't understand that prior to 1970, many lawyers actually flat feed many projects, but there was a court case that said they needed to move to an hourly rate.
Interesting.
Well, that's really helpful to know. And, one thing that Brock kind of alluded to in the introduction is that, sustainability at SECI, it really means a lot of different things. Sustainability of a business, your financial sustainability, that is a pretty important part of an operation. And so we appreciate you sharing that information, because I think it all, we as we want our clients to be successful in everything that they do. I really like the term you used of issue spotting, and it's, again, as professional services, we speak a lot of the same language, because when we go into a project or asked to assess something, we are issue spotting, and so that's really cool. So let's just be getting into something even a bit more specific. So let's say someone is going to expand or build a new feed yard. Can you go through the process where an attorney would fit in, or where you would be looking to spot issues to move a project forward?
Absolutely. We've certainly have done our fair share of projects, including some in which we worked with you folks as well. I have a colleague, Ann Post, who's probably the best in the state when it comes to these planning issues. And so I've worked with her on some of those projects. But let's kind of walk through some of the things you would need to look at, because it happens not only on the federal level and state level, but the local level as well. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is look at your local zoning, your local land use regulation to determine whether the intended project, whether it is a permitted use. And so that could be county zoning ordinances. In most settings, that what it's going to be. To the extent it's close enough to a city and their corporate jurisdiction and their zoning jurisdiction, some of that may come into play as well. And so you need to look at those zoning regulations to determine whether, in fact, this is a permitted use, whether, in fact, you perhaps may have to get what's called a special use permit. What is the process also? Do you have to appear before a planning commission? You have to appear before a county board? How many layers of approval do you need to get just to be able to use that real property, that dirt, in a way that you intend to use, whether it be for a feedlot, whether it be for some type of ag processing building or operation or whatever it may be. So again, let's determine what the land use regulations are. Two, from an environmental standpoint, you're going to have potential issues relative to how much runoff, how much drainage, how are we processing that? Do we have a discharge permit? Is a discharge permit necessary? That brings into other issues from a state and federal regulatory standpoint. But the starting point always is at the local level. What are the land use regulations we must consider in order to use this real property in the manner in which we intend? And so, again, it could be multiple steps, and make sure that in the planning process, you have an understanding this stuff doesn't happen quickly. It's great to blame lawyers, and yes, certainly we need to bear our fair share of the blame. But the reality is these processes often take a while because they can become political processes at which the public can have input. And there are certain areas of Nebraska, unfortunately, and there's certain areas in other states as well, that while they love the family farm and they love agriculture, they don't like having a hog operation or a poultry operation or a cattle feedlot, anywhere within 10 miles of them. Yet it provides jobs. It provides much needed revenue for local government from a property tax standpoint, from a sales tax standpoint. So again, understand that the public will probably be involved in that process and be given a chance to express opposition should they wish to.
And then at what point in the permitting process would you typically disengage from?
Yeah. So again, just like we talked about at the outset. So first thing is issue spotting, and then hopefully the client can see there's a cost benefit to retaining an attorney to help them through the process. There are some things clearly that the producer can do on their own, but there's going to be some things where it's just more cost effective to have a lawyer handle the filing of applications for a particular zoning use, to actually handle the hearing before a planning commission or a county board. And once you get that approval, it may be that the client has said, your retention is done, I can handle these other things on my own. Again, any decent attorney will say, I'm here to help, I'm your advisor, I am your counsel, I am here to help, but to the extent you think you can do some of these things on your own, feel free to do so. And I'm more than happy to provide advice on the side to assist you in that process. Again, whatever your budget is, but at a minimum, retain the attorney up front. We talked about that 1 hour meeting. Buy that 1 hour time to say, I'm thinking of building this facility on this particular parcel of ground. What do I need to consider? And hopefully they're going to go through, I've looked at this, the zoning for this particular parcel is, transitional ag. Here are the restrictions on transitional ag. You can build this, but we have to get a special use permit. Here's the process. It's first planning commission. That's the county board. And generally with all the publication requirements of the public hearing requirements, that's a 4-month, process. And so they would help you put together sort of a checklist of the requirements, and then you can decide with your attorney which of those items you want your attorney to handle, and which of those that you can handle internally or using other advisors, including SETCI, for example. If you guys are the engineers on the project, there's going to be things that you're going to be far more capable of doing in a cost-effective way than having legal counsel do it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, and you might be aware of the fact, Mark, that our listenership, it's very, very varied. We have cattle feeders, we have dairy producers, we have the people who we refer to as the people in town, and sometimes a lot of the things we talk about are really geared towards the people in town, because sometimes they're not quite so geared to understanding how sustainable, and dare I say, how regulated animal agriculture is. And so it's important for folks to hear that if someone wants to build a new feed yard or a new dairy, it's not just a matter of, call backhoe Joe and get to dig in and build. It is a regulated process where in many cases there is input taken from citizens.
And I think you want that input, right? Because these folks are probably going to be your neighbors for 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And so the fact that they have a voice in the process, and you're able to also share with them information about, I know you may have a sort of perception of what a feedlot looks like, smells like, whatever the other impacts may be, but here's today's modern feedlot. And here are the things that we do from a sustainability standpoint. Why, again, why we believe that we are, again, we're not a nuisance. We are actually productive citizens. We do everything we can to be neighborly as we continue to operate this business.
Switching gears, Mark, I would like to go back to something you mentioned in your introduction a little bit ago, and that is succession planning. So I'd like to ask you, what does it mean or look like for an agricultural enterprise to be sustainable across multiple generations? And why is that important?
I love the name of your podcast and the focus on sustainability, because sustainability, if you ask 10 different people, whether urban, suburban, or rural, what that means, you're going to get 10 different answers, right? And for me, sustainability is one, protecting and preserving our natural resources, but it's also making sure that it's economically viable for the producer, right? The producer shouldn't be forced to do so at a loss. And the same is true when it comes to sustainability, protecting the legacy of the farm. And in protecting that legacy and making it sustainable, we have to find ways in which we transition that operation from this generation to the next. I think most of us, know of farm and ranch families that haven't done that process successfully, right? We know about the family fights. I was recently at a farm auction in which I was bidding on some land. And I discovered that the room was split between two camps. And I asked a friend there, I said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, those are two brothers." And I said, "What?" And the parents had died without a will. And so the brothers were having to compete against each other for the parents' ground that they had farmed together for several years. And so you hate seeing that stuff happen. And so in order to protect that legacy and to make sure that that operation is sustainable for the future, you got to do that pre-planning. And we have at least 7 attorneys in my firm that focus entirely upon estate planning and succession planning, including in agriculture. And there are many innovative tools that they use in order to make that happen. And what they're really doing is they're having that tough conversation. To the extent farm families don't want to have that tough conversation, they're only kicking the can down the road, because that conversation is going to happen after they're gone. Have that tough conversation. How do we treat all the children fairly? How do we keep the operation to be able to continue to operate? Which of the children is going to operate it? And if they're not going to, how do we make sure it continues and the ownership continues and that all of the children are being treated fairly? And how do we do so in a way that minimizes the tax impact of that and the financial impact of that decision? And there are many innovative strategies that the estate lawyers, succession planning attorneys can employ to make that happen. And one of the problems in this area is that this area continues to change. For example, there's a federal state tax credit or exemption that's set to expire next year, at the end of next year, absent congressional action. I think most of us here on today's podcast, irrespective of your political party, understand that Congress doesn't get a lot done anymore, right? So they're going to have to take action in order to extend that. And unfortunately, the likelihood of that happening probably is not great. And so there's planning that needs to happen in 2024 and 2025 with the understanding that estate tax exemption may in fact not be extended and may go back to what it was before. So again, in order for the family ranch, the family farming operation to be sustainable, to be able to continue, to be able to protect that legacy, that requires having those tough conversations and planning now rather than kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, that really is great advice. I think it's something that's often overlooked, and overlooked part of sustainability.
Well, I think it's overlooked partly because of it's the hard conversation, and no one says, "Hey, I want to have a hard conversation today." But it's a matter of having the hard conversation today, so that you don't so others don't have to have a harder conversation further down the road. That's family fighting family is heartbreaking.
We have a new attorney joining us, and I'll tell you how he got to our firm. He's still involved in production agriculture. He got to our firm because his grandfather had two daughters, and he knew that he needed to pass it on. And so, how do you divide it? And so, grandfather, who was a wise gentleman, retained Tim Clare from our firm to sit down and say, okay, I want to pass this on to my two daughters. How can we do so that preserves the family and preserves the operation as well? And that was done so successfully that it inspired this young man to go to law school, because that's what he wants to do for a living. And he's in his third year of law school now, and he'll be joining our firm once he graduates. And so, again, if you do it right and have that tough conversation, there are solutions to those issues. You just got to talk about it.
Definitely. Yeah. So everyone can still sit down and get along at Christmas dinner at the end of
Correct.
the day.
Yeah. Coming back to one of the other facets of sustainability, that being the environmental sustainability, protecting the water, et cetera. A lot of those measures that are put in place under the category of sustainability involve the bioenergy projects. And so if we were just to look at a really high level, if someone was to be getting engaged in some kind of a bioenergy project, ethanol plant, anaerobic digestion, wind, solar, whatever, what are some really high level things that maybe someone could start issue spotting even before they get you involved or an attorney involved?
Yeah, great question. We've done work for ethanol plants. We've certainly have worked on a number of projects in which a number of these innovative energy technologies are being put into place in Nebraska. Digesters that could be solar, it could be wind as well. And in all those instances, understand that especially when it's generating electricity, generating energy, you got to send that somewhere. So it's an understanding of how do we partner with our power district. So in Nebraska, which is, I believe, the only all public power state, Tennessee, I think, is split. But Nebraska, you're here working with your public power district to be able to get access to that grid. And that is not a quick process, right? So certainly sitting down with the power district or the entity with which you're going to work in order to get access to the grid, you're going to have to start having those conversations early on to determine, okay, what are the requirements? What's the process? What's the time frame for making that happen? Secondly, another issue that we've had come up in this space is what tax credits are available, because a number of these technologies, there are tax credits, tax incentives that are available. You want to make sure that they're there for a reason, right? So don't feel bad about taking them. You need to maximize those, because that may, in fact, on the balance sheet, that may be what actually turns what may otherwise not be a profitable venture into a profitable one. And so you have to look at those. As I mentioned earlier, sustainability, at least my definition of sustainability, again, preserve and protect our natural resources, but it has to be economically viable and profitable for the producer as well. That's why those tax incentives are there. Take advantage of them. You have to sort of look at all these issues, have an understanding of them, and put that together in your business plan to make sure it actually works for you financially.
Mark, throughout the course of this conversation today, it's become very clear that you really are a trusted advisor to all of your clients in the ag industry, as well as all of your colleagues at your firm. And we know that everyone has trusted advisors, both in life and in business. Personally, we might think of our doctor, our auto mechanic, our accountant, a spouse, a best friend we go to, you name it. In your experience, what makes for a good trusted advisor for agricultural producers or for people who are running agricultural businesses when they're seeking an engineer or an attorney or an accountant or anyone else? What should they look for, and what should they look to avoid as they seek those advisors?
One, I would recommend that the individual at least have some background in agriculture or whatever the project may be. At least have some understanding. Again, it could be a generational way, but at least they've been on a farm, they've been on a ranch, they perhaps are invested in the industry. Two, you want to make sure that individual is willing to be candid with you, because there's sometimes we have to have candid conversations with our clients. And sometimes I'm just this blunt. Like, I think that's a really dumb idea, and here's why. I put myself in the shoes of the client, right? I want to hear the good things and bad things about projects, so I can make the rational decision for me and my entity what the best decision is. So I want to hear the bad stuff as too, and I want that attorney, that advisor, to be candid with me about the decisions I'm about to make. Three, you want to make sure that that is someone who's available, right? Attorneys are as bad as anyone else as far as being responsive. One of the biggest complaints attorneys often have, this applies with any service industry, is responsiveness. Part of the problem, in my opinion, in that area is what I call the Amazon Prime effect. And the Amazon Prime effect, as I describe it, is we can push a button on our computer and the package arrives either tomorrow and sometimes even today. And so when you talk to your attorney and retain an attorney, you want someone who's responsive, but understand that you may not be the only client that they're working with. And so you want to give reasonable timeframes and expectations as to, I have a contract I need you to review. Here's when I would like it by. Tell me if that works within your schedule. And so it's that communication back and forth, expectations as far as the completion of work projects, so that you're both on the same page. It's just got to be someone you gel with, that you trust, and someone who will be candid with you.
So, Mark, before we let you go, I want to ask you a kind of a fun question. And you're practicing in an area of agriculture where there's a lot of areas where you have old laws dating back and to when people did things a different way. For instance, I believe in Nebraska, it's something along the lines of where the property line becomes where the fence line is, or something like that. And
adverse possession. Yeah.
There you go. And I'm not picking on Nebraska. It's probably lots of places, but just for fun, you've been practicing law for quite a while. Can you give us just a fun example or two as far as like a law is like, seriously, is that still on the books, and does it ever pertain? Do you ever practice it?
Yeah, how much time do you have? I got lots of stories. So the first thing you mentioned is what's generally called adverse possession. It's always a question on the bar exam, right? Because they want to test you on it. And if you look through the case law in Nebraska, and this is generally in every state as well, there's so much litigation, so many reported cases on property ownership, and when, in fact, let's assume you put the fence on the wrong area. At what point does the ownership of that property transfer, even though there hasn't been a deed? And that's adverse possession. And in Nebraska, there's about 4 or 5 elements that have to be established. So it's got to be actual, continuous, exclusive, notorious, and adverse possession of that property. And I'll give you an example. One case we were involved in which a fence had been erected between 2 parcels, let's say back in the early 1900s. And both parties on both sides of the fence ran cattle on that particular area. Well, it turns out that fence wasn't on the property line. It was about 20 feet off of it. Meanwhile, the property owner who owned the property by deed, by title, was paying property taxes on that, but actually wasn't using 20 feet of that property by virtue of the placement of that fence. So then later on, that property sold, and someone decided to do a title search and look at and actually have a survey done. They discovered, hey, that fence is in the wrong place. And the other party said, no, actually, we've been using this. We can prove we've been using it since 1960. Therefore, it became ours by that doctrine of adverse possession. You have to dig up old evidence. You're looking at old satellite imagery to show how the property was used, how it was fenced. It gets very fact intensive and frankly expensive. So you don't want to litigate if you don't have to, because litigation, unfortunately, has become one of the more expensive things that you do in the law. So fence disputes come up all the time. They're never fun. And you want to try and avoid them simply by making sure that before you buy a property, don't assume that the fence is where the property line is, because often it is not. Another good example, is certainly the folks at SETI have an understanding with this. So Nebraska is the only state in the nation that the entire state is not covered by its brand law, meaning for those states that have brand requirements, only half of Nebraska is covered. And so you have part of the state which is in brand territory and half of the state which is not. And you often see, if you're traveling across Nebraska, signs that say entering brand territory. And it splits right literally down by Grand Island through the middle of the state, and west is all brand territory. And one of the things I get to do is I serve as outside legal counsel to the Nebraska Brand Committee. And so you tell folks outside Nebraska that there's a brand committee and they want to know what it's like. And I say, well, have you seen Yellowstone? And they say, well, yeah. I say, have you seen the Wyoming Livestock Commission? It's kind of the same deal. And so the brand committee, certainly they're investigators. They carry a badge, they carry a gun, they're certified law enforcement officers, and they actually do interdictions because, believe it or not, cattle rustling still happens. With the current cattle prices, there's a greater incentive for people to literally just back up a trailer to a pasture and steal someone's cattle and go try to travel across state lines to sell them somewhere else. And so there are all these very sort of specific requirements of the brand territory about inspections before sale, about carrying the bill of sale with you, about having those inspections done before you remove cattle from a particular area. And so, again, people may say that seems like it's back in the 1800s. Well, the brand laws are there for a reason. I'll tell you who one of the biggest proponents of the brand laws is the financial institutions in the state and those who provide financing to cattle owners, because that indicia of ownership is something that gives them protection when they're deciding what is the collateral we're loaning money on. And so someone can't back up that trailer. If they took those cattle to a sale barn in Nebraska, they wouldn't be able to sell them there because there is a brand inspector at that sale barn inspecting every head of cattle that goes through the sale barn. So again, it's a nice level of protection, especially for financial institutions who lend money on cattle. So again, it seems like it's something that's out of the 1800s, out of the old wild, wild west, but brand inspection is still a very important and big deal in Nebraska.
Well, I think those are two great examples. I was expecting something like you can't walk across the street on a waning Gibbons moon or something like that. But
we just don't see those laws certainly exist. I can think of another one in which it's actually under Nebraska's drover laws. And it's actually a criminal offense if your cattle get mixed up with someone else's and you don't remove them right away or cooperate with them. It's actually a criminal offense in the state of Nebraska. To the best of my knowledge, there has never been a case filed under that, right? But it still dates back to the days when you actually moved cattle by foot. That certainly still happens today, maybe from corn stalks over to pasture or vice versa. But moving them 100 miles at a time just doesn't happen like it did in the good old days.
Well, Mark, we really appreciate you joining us today. Any parting comments before we let you go?
Nope. Again, I am honored each and every day to have the opportunity to represent Nebraska's farmers, ranchers, agribusiness, and ag producers. I love what I do in that setting, and I appreciate all the work that Sechi does for some of our clients. Again, everything you folks do for our clients on many of those projects, it's top notch. And again, grateful for what you do for agriculture, and especially this podcast.
Well, we're grateful for what you do as well, and thank you again on behalf of Sechi and our listeners. And thank you to our listeners. We learned this week that we have people listening to us from Europe. We have people listening to us from the Middle East, and no matter where you are, this information, you don't have to be in Nebraska to find this information incredibly useful. Succession planning doesn't matter where you are. It's what you need to be thinking about and doing what's right in terms of environmental sustainability. Everybody should be thinking about those things. So, Mark, thank you again very much. And we look forward to having you all join us again for the next episode of Sustaining the Herd.